In a previous lesson, we went over the concept of environmental illumination by adding a texture to the world, which I have set up here. So let's see what that looks like, hitting Shift-Z in the viewport. And what an environment texture does is two very important things. It introduces general ambient light into the shadowing of our scene, as well as providing a surrounding world to be reflected in our object's materials. So environment lighting is a very important step towards realism. However, so far we've just been using typical JPEG images as the environment textures. And so the problem with this, if I start to orbit around and take a look at the actual texture, you can see that it's a very bright, clear, sunny day with a powerful sun in the sky. And so I want this to be positioned so that it more directly illuminates our objects from the front, or at least from a diagonal angle, rather than from the back. And so to set that up very quickly, over here in our surface panel in the vector slot, I'm going to click default and change that to right here, mapping. And everything goes black because I also need to assign something to this vector slot, clicking this button, and under texture coordinate, choosing generated. There we go, now we're back to where we started, but I have the ability here in the rotation options. You can see X, Y, and Z, the same axes as our 3D scene, which will allow me to rotate our world, let's say 200 degrees. And now our sun is more positioned towards the front of our scene. Yeah, okay, that's great. And so the problem with the environment texture, take a look at the car in the background. Notice how sharp and contrasted our shadows are. Because on such a clear sunny day, shadows like this are obviously realistic. This is a photograph after all. However, with the lighting of our scene, we don't get harsh shadows at all. And also in terms of the reflections, they're really quite dull, especially given the sun in the sky that is so bright, where there aren't even clouds blocking it from being so bright. And so this typical image format like JPEG is at very best a very limited approximation of true environment lighting. And this is where HDR comes in. And so before we get into what that actually is, let's go select one. It is just another type of image. Navigate to my HDRi folder. Let's choose this guy right here. And while this isn't the exact same image as the previous one, it is another sunny day with a very bright sun in the sky. So as we observe our image right here, we can see the photographer's shadow actually. And the shadows are once again very crisp and contrasted. But as far as our render goes, it's very noisy, and there are a lot of what are generally referred to as fireflies, and that's these really bright specks. And it's a type of rendering artifact that you always want to get rid of. And so we can fix this pretty easily in our world properties. If I scroll down to the bottom, we have a settings drop down. And I'm looking for this multiple importance checkbox down here. You should remember that setting from our lamp objects. And so if I enable that, you can see that our render result is much cleaner, though it is still fairly noisy. And so under that checkbox, we have a map resolution setting, which is set to 256 by default. And the higher I make this, the less noise we'll get from our lighting. So let's step this up, let's say to 1024. And that's looking pretty good, but I'm gonna even go up to 2048. And already we have a much cleaner result. Now do be mindful because as we can see here in the description, higher values potentially produce less noise at the cost of memory and speed. Now, at least up to 2048 on my system, I really don't see much change in speed, but I also have a lot of RAM. Anyway, what's important is notice that we see shadows now. Shadows that are very close to the shadows we see in the photograph. Now, they're not perfect because clearly these shadows are darker, but they're so much closer than the JPEG. Also notice the highlights in our reflections. If I go back to camera view hitting the 0 key, we can see the very strong crisp highlight from the sun that you would expect. And these type of bright highlights, in my opinion, is a dead giveaway that HDRi is being used. So if I switch back over to the previous environment texture, even though we're at the same strength of 1, everything is so dull in the reflections and the shadows are completely blurry and not defined. Jumping back to our HDRi, all of a sudden we're breathing life into the scene. And so this is so easy, it feels like cheating because there's no lamp objects in the scene, no lamp settings to tweak per lamp. It's just a single texture, and we've taken a huge step towards photorealism. And finally, to conclude this course, I think I'll swap in a couple other examples from my collection of CC BY HDR environments. And let's take a look at this one. which apparently has a very strong singular light source that's casting these stark shadows. Let's take a look at the environment, and there's our light source right there. Judging by our lighting, that is way more powerful than anything else in the scene. And man, it's just really cool to get all of that for such little work. I'm going to do an actual render so that we can see a cleaner version, which still renders very quickly. I'm at 25 seconds here. And for that, we have to thank this multiple importance setting down here. Before this was available, HDRIs took forever to render clean. Let's try one more image, switch to slot 2. And let's go find one more example, like this one in the forest. The overall energy is much lower, which makes sense given the time of day, kind of sunset. Also, we're surrounded by a forest, so lots of shade. But we can tweak our strength if we want. Let's double it to 2 to get a little more energy from our image's high dynamic range, which, by the way, HDRi stands for High Dynamic Range Image. And so finally, to kick off this render, and now you know how to easily set up photorealistic lighting using HDRi environment textures.